So good afternoon, everybody. I think we'll make a start. I'd like to welcome you to the third public lecture in our Healthy Aging series here at James Cook University in Singapore. My name is Chris Rudd. I have the honor to be Deputy Vice Chancellor and Head of Campus, and it is my enormous pleasure to introduce our guest for this afternoon, Dr. Brian Kennedy, who is going to share his expertise with us. I just want to mention before we get into the introduction a little bit of housekeeping. So first of all, we will be recording the webinar for publicity purposes, and we absolutely encourage all of you to participate by asking questions throughout the talk, and you can post your questions up on the Q&A function that's built into the bottom of the screen. Just around that, so Brian, whilst has a huge amount of expertise in this topic, he is not a clinician and will not be providing advice on any of the artifacts of aging that you might be experiencing. So please respect that, and let's confine the questions to objective scientific insights. The other thing is that there will be a satisfaction poll at the end of the webinar. So rather than just dashing for the bus or MRT at the end of the Q&A, if you wouldn't mind just spending 1 minute clicking on the satisfaction bar. If you are experiencing any issues on a technical point of view, then use the chat function, please, to communicate with the organizers. And so let's get into the introduction. So Brian is a world expert on the basic biology of aging, and his contributions to translating research discovery into new ways of detecting, delaying, and preventing human aging and the associated diseases that go with that are very widely respected around the world. He is currently a professor in the departments of biochemistry and physiology at National University of Singapore. He is also director of the Center for Healthy Longevity in NUHS. And before that, he was from 2010 to 2016 president and CEO of the Buck Institute for Research in Aging in California, and currently he remains a professor at the Buck Institute. And so with that, I am delighted to invite Dr. Brian Kennedy to present his public lecture. Over to you, Brian.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to give the lecture. Let me see if I can get the screen share to work. It always works when you do the practice, and then you run into challenges when the real thing starts, but I think we're going to get there. And I'll remember to turn on the laser pointer. Okay, so I'm going to tell you today a little bit about some strategies to extend healthy longevity. And the approach we're taking is really towards prevention. How do we take people that are still healthy and keep them healthy as long as possible? There's another approach which would involve geriatrics and managing an aging population, which is equally important, but it's less what we're concerned about. Our main focus is to keep people from undergoing functional decline and encountering the challenges of aging. And I think probably everyone has seen a slide like this before. I can't resist showing it though, because I think it illustrates the profound change in society that's happening in my lifetime. I was born in 1967. And at that time, there were 3 times as many people under the age of 5 as over the age of 65. Finding older people was still relatively rare. And by the time 2050 rolls around, and I'm hoping to be there to see it, there'll be 3 times as many people over the age of 65 as under the age of 5. So we talk about changes to society, how progress, challenges that are occurring, but it's hard to find one that's really more impactful from this than this. And I really believe that this is the biggest medical challenge of the 21st century. The problems that are associated with health as people get older are becoming more and more prevalent and costing more and more to deal with. And we have to come up with solutions to meet these challenges. So this is Singapore. As you can see over here on the left, the number of people over the age of 65 is going up here. We're, at the forefront of the aging challenge. By 2030, there will be only 2 working people for every retired person in this country. So the Singapore government has recognized this and decided that something has to be done. I think they're still in the process of trying to decide how to deal with this aging issue, but the simple facts are that if you have a old age support ratio that's that low, you have a major economic challenge. So this is not just about improving quality of life in the population. It's about solving a major and growing economic issue. So this is the change in life expectancy from 1990 to 2010 in Singapore. Singapore is one of the longest lived countries in the world. And as you can see, life expectancy has been going up rapidly. So if you're a male in Singapore during this period, you got about a 30% return on investment. For every 3 years you live, you can expect to live 1 year longer. And that sounds great. The problem is that healthy life expectancy, or what I call health span, is not going up at the same rate as life expectancy. So what that means is the current medical system is keeping you alive longer, but it's keeping you sick longer. And it's all the costs, or almost all the costs, are in this growing gap. And so this current approach, which I would call sick care, has some benefits, and certainly if I get sick, I want to be treated, but it's also creating challenges. Another way of looking at this is the cost that's associated with people with chronic disease in the aging population. So if you look at people over 65 that have no chronic illnesses, they're still relatively low costs, about $2,000 US, a little bit more. But once you get to 2 chronic diseases, that cost goes up 6-fold. And many people in this age range have 3 or 4 chronic conditions, and they're getting worse progressively. And so this is one of the key take-home messages, that we've always, both from a research perspective and also from a therapeutic perspective, tried to deal with all of these diseases in isolation. So somebody has a heart attack, we treat them for that. They start to show signs of cognitive decline, we try to treat them for that. They get diabetes, we treat them for that. And I want to try to convince you today that we're missing a huge opportunity, because all of these diseases share one thing in common, and that's aging. Aging is the biggest risk factor for not only these chronic diseases, but the vast majority of chronic diseases that are increasing in prevalence in humanity globally. And so if this is a risk factor, maybe we should do something about aging, because that will either prevent or at least delay the onset of all of these conditions simultaneously. And it's hard to get through a lecture without COVID-19, so I'll talk just a little bit about it today. And the point I want to make is that we're missing the boat here too. The CDC in the United States just published in the New York Times 14 major risks for complications due to COVID-19. They didn't bother to mention age. And yet, if you look at the risk over here on the left, the risk related to being over the age of 70 is at least 5 times higher than any other risk factor for complications due to COVID-19, including cardiovascular disease and diabetes. This risk is independent of these diseases. Something about aging makes it hard for you to compensate for the challenges that come with acute infection. So really, when I talk about this, I'm selling myself short on the left here. What we really should be saying is aging is driving chronic diseases. It's also driving the complications associated, at least the complications associated with acute diseases. And of course, it's driving functional decline as well. And if the benefits of slowing down this aging process are in the US, if you do the economics, they're measured in the trillions of dollars. And so this is kind of how we're thinking right now. And most people get confused when we talk about longevity. We're really about health span. So if you look on the top the top row, looking at current treatment, you have a period of time in your life where you're healthy. You don't have any diagnosis of disease. you're still functioning well. Eventually, however, you cross this barrier, you start to get chronic diseases, and this is where we pour in all the healthcare and try to treat you. And it prolongs life, but eventually you succumb to the challenges that accompany these diseases. What we're trying to do is not add time on the end here when you're sick. It's to extend this period of health span while you're still functioning, and maybe even compress the period which you have disease. So the goal here really is a long health span with compressed morbidity. And in Singapore, we're trying to drive this, and the benefits are myriad. At the individual level, we're really promoting things like life quality, improving independence late in life if we're successful with this approach. And at the societal level, and retirement age is already creeping up here as well as in many other countries, we're trying to extend productive work years. So if you're working later in life, you're still competent and efficient at doing it. At the government level, a standard approach around the world is to build more hospitals, build more nursing homes. This costs a lot of money and it's just putting Band-Aids on the problem. If we can keep people healthy, we can reduce the need for this and keep people at home and happy. And with working with the Singapore Clinical Research Institute, it's estimated that for every 1 million people, we can save about 600. So for the Singapore population, we can save $3 billion in healthcare savings by extending health span by just 5 years. And then we're also, and I'm not going to talk much about this today, we're also trying to nucleate biotech companies in the longevity sector. It turns out that for a long time, you couldn't get private sector money to approach the problem of aging for a number of reasons, one of which aging is not classified as a disease indication. But that's changed dramatically over the last 5 to 10 years. There are now investment funds. There are probably 50 to 100 companies around the world targeting aging in all kinds of different ways. And we think Singapore can be a hub for this activity, and we're working hard to try to achieve that. So I'm not going to talk too much about mechanisms of aging today. I do want to put one slide up because a lot of you, I'm sure, hear different things about the aging process, and that we've listed. This came from a review a bunch of faculty got together and wrote about 7 or 8 years ago now, where we identified 7 drivers of aging. And in putting together this review, what struck me was not how important each driver was, but how connected they are. You can get from any one of these things, like altered metabolism to inflammation, very easily from thinking about things biologically. And so I prefer to think of aging a little bit differently. As you get older, damage is happening. And that does affect functional output. You can't run as fast at 45 as you do at 20. We don't see any world-class football players at the age of 45. That's aging doing that. But most of those people are still functional. They're still highly effective in what they do. They're not really feeling like they're old. And that's because there's a homeostatic network in your body that maintains health. It compensates for damage, and it tries to optimize your ability to function. And as long as that's working, we think your disease risk is relatively low. What happens, though, is that when enough damage happens, there's enough compromise to this network that it starts to break down, and you spin out of equilibrium, and that's when you get sick. And when you combine that with individual disease risk factors, genetics, lifestyle, you get one or more of these chronic diseases of aging. So the concept is, if we can maintain this network longer, then we can offset all of these diseases. And I actually think it's going to be easier to preserve the network and keep you healthy than it is to try to treat you after you get sick. And we're finding that with a lot of chronic diseases, it's very hard to develop therapeutics, even to stop the progression of the disease, not to mention curing the disease. But none of this particularly matters if we can't do anything about aging. And so I want to spend some time trying to convince you that it's possible to slow the aging process. And in point of fact now, there are actually people and some evidence that it may ultimately be possible to reverse the aging process. And that is a much more dramatic statement, and I don't think we know for sure whether it's possible or not, but slowing it, I'm pretty convinced. Now, there's 3 circles here. This was done with in partnership with a private company called Centaur. It was a review we wrote. there's 3 circles here, the dark red circle, and those are lifestyle interventions. And they weren't fully researched. I'm not quite going to go there, but what we're talking about are things like exercise, diet, stress management, and sleep quality. We know that all of these things impact aging. And we know more or less how to tell people to utilize things like exercise and a healthy diet to stay healthy longer and live longer. The challenge in this circle is getting people to comply. I can tell everyone to be vegan marathon runners, but most of you aren't going to do that. So the challenge is, how do we find sustainable changes to lifestyle that can be scaled to a population that result in extended health span? And this is certainly one of the areas we're working in, but I don't think it's the only solution to the problem, and maybe not one that can impact the majority of people. A second level are sort of drugs and small molecules, and that's where most of the research is today, and that's what I'm going to tell you about. And then there's a third level of more radical interventions: gene therapy, organ replacement, stem cell regenerative studies, and even crazier things. And I think it's great that people are thinking about these challenges. They're probably not ready for prime time, but maybe not that far away either. So I can answer questions about those if you're interested. So these are just small molecules that I work on in my lab to target aging. And so there's 8 or 9 things here. There's probably, if we went around the world and looked at the research, there's at least 50 to 100 of these small molecules now that there's some evidence that they impact the aging process. And I obviously don't want to go through all of those. I'm going to talk about 2 today: alpha-ketoglutarate and spermidine. But I'm happy to answer questions about the others as well. And my lab's done a lot of research on rapamycin and the TOR pathway in aging. The first thing I'm going to tell you is a partnership with a company. So this is a disclosure. We work with a company called PDL Health, and they were interested in finding natural products that can impact lifespan and health span. And so briefly, what was done is we screened a lot of natural products in worms to find things that extended lifespan, and then took those to mice and did mouse aging studies. And I'm going to tell you about one of those today. We start the mice at 18 months. That's a late middle-aged mouse. And then we looked at survival and also frailty in mice. There's now a frailty index that can be used to tell you how well the mouse is doing with aging. And that index corresponds to human frailty studies. So that's a really good measure of health span. And we also looked at stem cell function and different pathways of aging. I'm not going to talk too much about that. This is the lifespan study. So this is a survival curve. We're looking at the percent of animals that are alive at a given age. So the 50% survival for a control mouse is somewhere around 29 to 32 months in most studies. These are black 6 mice, if you're interested. The lifespan effects of AKG are modest. They're there. There's about a 5 to 10% extension in females and a not quite significant extension in males. We've done 4 different cohorts now. This repeats over and over again. And if you add all the cohorts together, it becomes significant in males as well. But it's not the lifespan effect that really jumped out and excited us. What really excited us was the frailty. And so I'm going to jump into a little bit more deeply into the science here for just a few slides. And this is probably the most complicated slide I'm going to show you, so I want to explain it a little bit. So what we're looking at is frailty by age. And on the left, we're just taking the animals at different months of age, looking at these 31 metrics of frailty and creating an index of frailty. So the higher the number, the more frail the animal. And you can see that the control animals in blue, the frailty goes up faster than the AKG treated animals. But this is not an easy way to look at this, and I'll tell you why. Because some of the animals, the sick animals especially, are dying during this window. So for instance, this animal, which has very high frailty at 23 months, is dead by 25 months. So it's not on the curve. So it gets hard to do the statistics. So to compensate for that, what we did is waited until all the mice were dead, and then went back and calculated the percentage of the animal's lifespan where we did the frailty measure. So 50 to 60%, 60 to 70%, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what you can see is that the control animals go up steadily in frailty as they approach the end of life, and that's dramatically suppressed in the AKG-treated animals. So while there's only a 10% extension in lifespan. There's a 50% reduction in frailty. So in these animals, we're compressing morbidity. I'm showing you the female data. The same data is true for frailty in males. But I think a picture is always informative. And so if you look at 27 months in these animals, the control animals are having all kinds of problems. They have alopecia, dermatitis, kyphosis. Some of these mice have tumors, if you look at them, and a range of other challenges of aging. And you can see, I think, that this is largely suppressed in the AKG-treated animals. This is a very profound effect, and it doesn't take, too much of a scientist to say that if I have to be one of these animals, I want to be on this group and not in this group. So what is AKG? A little bit of biochemistry. One slide. This is the TCA cycle. Alpha-ketoglutarate is a principal component of that. It's a central metabolite. It goes down during the aging process, and supplementing it back up provides more metabolic flexibility to cells so that they continue to function better. And actually, we've shown that when you administer AKG, you get a better adult stem cell function, as I mentioned, better metabolic flexibility. You get better mitochondrial function and more ATP production. There are interesting alterations to the microbiome that we're still trying to understand. Perhaps very importantly, we see a dramatic reduction in inflammation. So levels of chronic inflammation are a big driver of the aging process, and that's suppressed here. And then we've looked at a number of aging biomarkers, and I think I'll come back to those at the end of the talk when we talk about how we're doing human studies. Briefly, this is just the inflammation. So just focus on the panel A here. The bottom row are the baseline animals at 18 months, and everything's normalized to 1, which is this orange color. When things get more red by 28 months, that means the level of these inflammatory cytokines is going up. So most things are going up in the mice, and that's dramatically reduced in the AKG-treated animals. So the anti-inflammatory effects of AKG are really exciting. Now I want to go back and talk a little bit about exercise, because bodybuilders and athletes have been taking alpha-ketoglutarate for a long time. And these are just 3 articles I found in 5 minutes online. There's many others talking about the benefits of AKG, enhanced athletic performance, better wound healing, better muscle repair. And remember that muscle damage is one of the ways you drive anabolic activities in muscle, and through exercise, and a range of other potential activities. And so one thing is that if AKG is increasing exercise performance and you exercise, it may synergize with that exercise to impact aging. And it also got us thinking about how AKG might affect exercise. And we looked at a bunch of literature. This paper was actually before I was born, talking about the utilization of alpha-ketoglutarate for red blood cells for glutathione synthesis. So as you may know, glutathione is an antioxidant, and it's particularly important in red blood cells because there's a lot of oxidative damage with hemoglobin carrying oxygen all over the place. And without functional mitochondria, red blood cells have to do things very, very differently. And it turns out that in these cells, alpha-ketoglutarate is a rate-limiting component of glutathione production. 89% of the glutathione is derived from AKG. And so if you can imagine AKG levels going down with age, then that could be a problem for these cells. And we've been able to show in vitro that if you add AKG, you can improve glutathione levels in cells in culture and also in animals. This is 1-week treatment looking at glutathione levels. So that leads to one model for what AKG is doing, with glutathione, sorry for the spelling error, decreasing with age. Red blood cells take up AKGs, and AKG is going down with age. So if you add it back, you can restore glutathione production in red blood cells, increase function, and improve oxygen delivery to muscle, which may underlie the exercise phenotype and the aging phenotype. So we're very interested in this pathway. It's also interesting in the context of COVID-19 because reduced oxygen delivery is one of the major risk factors for major predictors of survival in affected COVID-19 patients. So what happens is their pulse ox goes down dramatically as they get sick. And AKG, if it's improving oxygen carrying capacity, which we think it is, may be one way to get people through this very difficult, challenging time. allow them to survive until their system works better to clear the virus. So we're interested in it from that perspective as well. And I think that one thing I want to mention is that learning about aging is useful for not only chronic disease, but for these viral infections too. So one of the theories about aging has always been that nitric oxide levels go down with age, and that improving nitric oxide may be a way of slowing the aging process. And so this is nitric oxide production with age, and this is the decline in production again in 2 different studies. So you can see a really dramatic effect. It turns out most people think inducible nitric oxide synthase is the big driver of nitric oxide production, but in endothelial cells, there's also an endothelial nitric oxide synthase. And when you're under inflammatory conditions, that activates this enzyme to produce nitric oxide, and that serves as a primary defense mechanism in innate immunity when you get a viral infection. And we know that endothelial cells are vascular endothelial cells are heavily influenced by this virus, and maybe one site where severe complications are arising. And so it's been shown a long time ago with another virus that if you just increase nitric oxide levels, you can improve the resistance to this is influenza, improve resistance to influenza. So we were curious about this and wrote a concept paper on this recently. And it was the best review we've ever gotten because this was not really our field. And the reviewer came back and said, you know, there are a lot of polymorphisms in endothelial nitric oxide synthase. Maybe you should have a look at them and see if it correlates to anything. And so what I plotted here, there are many alleles of nitric oxide synthase. I won't go into it. What we're looking here is the prevalence of the wild type or the functional allele of eNOS. A lot of people have mutations which reduce function, and the death per million due to coronavirus. And there are a lot of complicating factors here causing mortality due to coronavirus, how good the treatment is in different countries, and a whole range of other things. But the striking thing here is that the countries, at least at this time when we did this study, that had a relatively low mortality were also the ones where you have the highest prevalence of the wild type allele of eNOS. So again, we think using aging, we're learning about interesting things regarding a response to acute infections. And of course, there are ways to increase eNOS. And a lot of these molecules have been linked to aging. Statins have been linked to aging. Resveratrol has been linked to aging, as well as adding back hormones like estrogen. And I won't mention blue pills, but that's another way of increasing nitric oxide synthase. And finally, vitamin D, which has been shown to slow aging in animal models, is also a regulator of eNOS. So we're looking heavily at this pathway, both with respect to aging and viral response right now. Just a couple more slides on science, and then I'm going to get to humans. So another thing we got interested in is spermidine. The reason AKG and spermidine are particularly interesting is they're natural products, and they have very high safety profiles. So you, from a company perspective, you can go to market already with them. But it also gets around this challenge of aging not being identified as a disease by the FDA. Hard to get a new drug approved for something that's not a disease, but if it's a natural product, it's a much easier path. Spermidine is, unlike AKG, is in a lot of different food sources. So diet's one way to get spermidine. It's produced by the microbiome and through endogenous cellular metabolism. And what was shown is that if you add spermidine to mice, either throughout life, throughout life or starting late, you could get lifespan extension. Surprisingly, no one had shown metabolic effects of spermidine. Most things that extend lifespan improve metabolism. So we went back and looked. So this is our survival data. We weren't really doing lifespans here. We had a few mice we let go to survival. And so we can repeat the effects of spermidine on lifespan. But interestingly, what we found is that when you treat mice with spermidine and put them on a high-fat diet, or look at old mice, they have a reduction in fat content and improved metabolism. And so we think this is, again, another example of how natural products that extend lifespan are probably doing it by improving the metabolic activity of cells. And one interesting activity of spermidine is it drives triglyceride breakdown in fat cells. So you get reduced visceral fat by activating these enzymes that get rid of triglycerides. So another different kind of mechanism, but leading to improved metabolism all the same. I just wanted to show these as some examples of things that are slowing aging. These are not wild new drugs that have never been in people. These are things people are already taking. And so if we can validate that they affect aging, we can rapidly move these into widespread use. So coming back to NUS, what we've done is set up a healthy longevity program. We have about 40 faculty in it now, some of which are like me working on basic biology of aging, but we also have a focus on muscle aging, brain aging, vascular aging, and we have a new group we're adding on regenerative medicine and aging, and another group looking at female reproductive aging now. So we're really trying to expand this group. We're very collaborative, and we're happy to work with anyone who has ideas on how to test the aging process. But this is all fine. So what I've convinced you so far is if you're a mouse, we got you. We can make you live longer, healthier, but most of you listening probably aren't mice. And so how do we get human? So I think we have three goals. One is to validate that interventions work in humans. The second one is to optimize and personalize those interventions. I don't think any single intervention is going to work in everyone. We have to understand who responds to which kinds of interventions. Even exercise, which is pretty much clear, works to extend lifespan. Even that is probably individual specific. The right type of exercise for each person is probably different. And then we have to do things in ways that scale. So while I work with companies on some exotic things like stem cell injections and stuff like that, we're not in the academic side working on $100,000 interventions right now. What we're trying to do is look at relatively cheap interventions that might affect aging that we can rapidly move to the population. So how do you validate a clinical trial for intervention that affects aging? So pharmaceutical companies have taken sort of the first approach. And that, again, relates to the fact that aging is not a disease and they have to get reimbursed, so they need a disease. So they may get interested in some pathway or drug because it targets aging, but then they rapidly switch to doing clinical trials trying to treat disease. And so far, this has not worked so well, and it's led to several high-profile failures. I think that, while slowing aging may be very effective while you're still healthy and that network is still functioning, whether it works after you're in a state of chronic disease is an entirely different question. And so I think that I understand why people do these studies. Companies I work with do them, but I'm a little bit concerned that this is not the best way to get to healthy aging. Second approach you can take is to prevent disease. And there's a large study called the TAME trial with metformin going on in the US right now, 3,000 people, 14 clinical sites. Study goes on for 3 years. And the idea is that metformin, which is a diabetes drug, well, since it slows aging, it won't just work to prevent diabetes, it'll also prevent a whole range of other diseases of aging. And that's the endpoint that they're going after in this clinical trial. I don't have any problem with this, except that it's extremely slow and expensive. And I don't think any of us know which interventions are going to work in humans right now. So I don't want to spend $60 million on one test. So what we're doing here is smaller, more targeted, and something that we can compare agnostically different kinds of interventions. So what we're using are aging biomarkers. And so I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what aging biomarkers are. Just to give you an overview for the clinical study on AKG, the top one is sponsored by the company in the United States and is ongoing right now. The bottom one is something we have planned at NUS, and they're very similar, so I'll just go through them briefly. The idea is to take 45 to 65-year-olds. We don't want to start these studies in older, frail people, again, because I don't know whether things will work after you're in that condition or not. They may. But what we want to do is take people that are still largely healthy but at risk of disease. And those we think are the best place to start to look at interventions that slow aging. Now, you might argue that the best place to start is as soon as you become an adult at 20, and that may be true, but it's a lot harder to think about an intervention that you give to a 20-year-old and for 50 years. So we want to start first in this middle age range. Interventions are 6 to 9 months, and we want to look at aging biomarkers and a range of other things. There's a lot more things we're looking at in the Singapore study. And so what we're trying to do really here is to build an iterative testing strategy. So we've refined how we do mouse experiments now to make them as close to human studies as possible. Shorter term mouse studies using aging biomarkers and frailty in mice as well as in the human studies. Therefore, we can find things that work in animals, move them rapidly to humans, figure out what works, go back, try to refine things in mice, or even combine different interventions together and keep working back and forth. We're also interested in mechanisms. We have a few disease models we're intrigued by, and we're working with Dean Ho to try to do precision dosing. So instead of giving all the animals one dose of a supplement or drug, let's figure out how much each animal needs and optimize per animal. And if we can get that to work, I think the effects might be much larger, and we'll move that into human studies as quickly as possible. So we have a new center, clinical center set up. The main research goes on in US, but the clinical center is at Alexandra Hospital. It took a while to get this this place renovated, and so we're showing a lot of pictures of it because I think that we were all having nightmares about getting renovations done. And we're actually bringing people in now and measuring biologic aging. We've done about 45 or 50 people. The first study is cross-sectional, just trying to see how different biomarkers work in Singapore. And then we're going to follow that up with interventions, one with exercise, one with AKG, and we have 5 to 10 more planned. So I need to talk about chronologic and biologic age. You know your chronologic age. Your passport is extremely good at measuring your chronologic age. That's a feature of time since you were born. But we all know that if you look at 5 people who are 50 years old, you can just with your eyes tell that some of them are aging more quickly than others. How do you measure that in a meaningful way? And so that's led to these biologic age markers. And I want to take 2 individuals here, a relatively fast ager and a slow ager. So one thing about these biologic markers is they're oscillating. They don't move up steadily like chronologic markers. So you might be sick, you might have a bad lifestyle, you're not getting sleep, you're eating the wrong foods, too much McDonald's, et cetera, and you might in 1 month be much older biologically than your chronologic age. You go back to a healthier lifestyle, you clear the virus, and then you might oscillate back toward a healthier biologic age. And so I think everybody's moving around like this, maybe on a weekly or monthly basis. The idea is that as this number goes up, your functional parameters are going down, and eventually you cross this disease threshold and you start getting sick. What we're trying to do is move people into this range. A good example is my grandmother. She was relatively healthy at 97 and got sick at 101 when she was still living in her house and died 3 months later. So these are people that have a low biologic age. It goes up less quickly, and they don't cross this threshold until much later. This gap here is what we're trying to maximize. And so people tried to look for biologic markers of aging for a long time. There have been things like walking speed, grip strength, things you measure in people non-invasively. The challenge to this is that these things predict mortality fairly well if you're over 70 years old, but our intervention group is younger than that. So we need a way to look at biologic aging in a younger population. If you look at individual markers, they're really not so good at predicting mortality. There's a little bit of correlation, but not that much. Even things like telomere length, which everybody talks about, doesn't predict that well. And so what is the solution to understand biologic aging? And what's emerged now are these molecular markers that come from omics, transcriptomics, epigenetic patterns like DNA methylation patterns, proteomics, metabolomics, microbiome composition, facial pattern. There's a lot of them now. If you collect a lot of data and enough people and then let artificial intelligence programs optimize to age, you get a measure that we think corresponds to the biologic age of the individual. And so that's what we're doing now. We're looking at a whole range of these different biomarkers of aging in our clinical studies. We have 2 sorts of rules right now. One is we don't want to go beyond a blood draw. If I have to do a muscle biopsy, that's fine, but I can't scale it to the population and can't even get enough volunteers. So we're doing nothing more than a blood draw. And ultimately, the goal is to combine these features in a way that for $200, we can accurately measure the biologic age of an individual. So there are physiologic things like pulse wave velocity, which measures how fast a pulse travels through your body, and arterial stiffness, DEXA, measures of cardiorespiratory fitness. These are things people have done for a long time, but we're combining it with biomarkers of age from DNA methylation patterns, from metabolites, from inflammatory markers, and also from this, I mentioned this a minute ago, from facial pattern reconstruction. It turns out in the Chinese population, we can reconstruct a three-dimensional view of your face, and based on 40 or so different measures we can do, predict your biologic age almost as well as DNA methylation. This is standing still for 90 seconds to get a photo taken. It's completely non-invasive. And so if it turns out to work as well as we hope, we think it may be one of the major ways you can measure age rapidly in a large population. Imagine when you get your new photo for your ID card, we use this technology and we also generate how well you're aging. And so the aging biomarkers are emerging. We're really in the second generation now where we have these omics-based data sets combined with clinical biomarkers, and they predict mortality, they predict disease onset, they predict age, and perhaps most importantly, the early data suggests that they respond to interventions. So we can make you biologically younger with some of these interventions. That I don't think that's validated, but we're starting to move in that direction. And I'll just close by saying that we're doing a number of studies, and we're very open to ideas people may have. So you're welcome to contact us, collaborate, anything you want to do. So we're doing this cross-sectional study of biologic aging. If you're 45 to 65 and in Chinese ethnicity, you can sign up for the clinical studies too. Eventually, it's important to us to really expand these studies to other ethnicities. But right now, with the resources we had to improve our power to detect differences, so we're staying with the Chinese ethnicity. Exercise, alpha-ketoglutarate, and a range of other things we have planned. We're also collaborating with a lot of different groups in NUH, trying to look at whether biologic aging is meaningful. And I'll give you one example. We're working with bariatric surgeons now. So they usually treat people who are high levels of obesity. You band the stomach, and the newer surgical methods are very effective at causing weight loss and improved metabolism. What we expect is these people were biologically older at the time when they were still obese, and treating their metabolic defect this way actually may improve their biologic age as well. So we're trying to test a range of different kinds of clinical interventions to see what they do to the age of the individual. And then we have a lot of collaborations that I won't talk too much about. I think what I'll do is just show one last slide, and then I'm happy to take questions. We have our own webinar series now on healthy longevity. It's pretty much deep science, not entirely that. We've had people like Paul Irving talking about demographics of aging, but we're really interested in the science of aging, the interventions, and the ways to measure aging. We also bring investors on periodically to talk about what they're putting their money down on in terms of ways to slow the longevity process. So if you're interested in diving more into the science, you can go to the website. It's free to register, and we have 3 shows a month now with different people around the world. I just want to, these are people that have helped me. I didn't show a whole lot of my science, but the people in blue here are ones that have worked on either the alpha-ketoglutarate or the spermidine projects, or they're doing the human studies. I have a lot of collaborators and funding agencies, etc. Thanks a lot for coming to the talk and inviting me, and I'm excited to hear any questions you might have about the aging process.
Brian, many thanks both for exposing us to some really thought-provoking research, but also for absolutely being right on the money in terms of timing. So
that's the first time ever for me. So you're just lucky.
Yeah. And we have got some amazing questions, which I think will entertain us for the next 20 minutes or so. And I'd encourage others to fire them in through the Q&A bar. And I'm going to kick off with Professor Nigel Marsh, who represents the psychology discipline here in JCU Singapore. And Nigel asks a very kind of local question, which is about the relationship between working longer and staying healthy longer, which is absolutely a Singapore thing, and your comments on the kind of correlation between health span and working life.
Yeah, I think that what I tell people is that the last thing you want to do is retire, go sit at home, watch TV. And so I think that it's not good for the aging process. So, I think that if people are active and working, enjoying what they're doing, they should be able to keep doing it as long as possible. Professors, in the US, we tend to die in our office at like 85 years old. We're probably not doing that good of science anymore, but we just didn't want to leave the research. And there's a real element of, I think, staying active, staying engaged, staying empowered. All of these things are important for aging. I don't think it has to be through work. It can be through volunteering, retraining for new jobs, raising grandkids. There are all kinds of ways to stay active, but I think that it's much healthier in general for the population if you can find something to stay engaged. And, I think that this raising retirement age, at least in an optional way, is a great thing for Singapore to do. Trying to push people out of work that are still productive and active, I think, is not, in this current demographics, not the best idea. And I just want to comment that the psychological component of aging is also very big. I'm very interested in testing mindfulness strategies and other things. I think that's been underappreciated so far because biology of aging has been largely in animal models where it's really difficult to address things like that. But I'm convinced that people that have self-awareness, practice some kind of mindfulness strategy, that may be just as important as exercise.
Thanks. And then so we got another one from Denise, who says that if we were to successfully extend the healthy years of living, how would that change the prevailing causes of mortality?
So far, the interventions that extend lifespan in animals, they don't really change the diseases, they just delay the onset of the diseases. So the rapamycin-treated mice, for instance, live 30% longer. They still get cancer, they still show signs of cognitive decline, and other things that mice get, kyphosis, but it's delayed. So the best guess right now is that you just kind of push that envelope out. Now, one interesting question is, do these interventions extend maximum lifespan or just median lifespan? In other words, are we getting more people toward their natural maximum in lifespan, or are we pushing the whole curve out? And in humans, we don't know the answer to that. But like with AKG, where you get compressed morbidity, I think what we might be doing there is allowing more people to get closer to that maximum lifespan. And so they stay healthy much longer. Then when they get sick at an older age, the decline is much faster, and that's why you get compressed morbidity. But so far, there's not evidence of a dramatic change in what causes people to die in these interventions.
Brian, there's some really interesting points being made around ethnicity, and you sort of touched on it a little bit in your talk. But do you want to comment on the difference between, for example, Asian populations and Caucasians in terms of propensity to the more visible effects of aging?
So, like, for instance, Japanese populations are the longest lived in the world, or at least they were, and there's some argument that Hong Kong might be there now. But anyway, they're very long lived relative to Caucasians. What's pretty clear is if you take Japanese people, put them in the United States, the next generation doesn't live longer anymore. So the bulk of the evidence suggests that it's not genetic changes that's affecting lifespan, it's lifestyle. And, if you look at lifestyle in Japan, one thing that always strikes me, back when I used to be able to travel, was that when you go to Japan, what you see is like little 80-year-old women who are carrying groceries home every day. They walk to the grocery, they grab something, they take it home. I think there's a more active lifestyle there. And what's happened in the US is that I have to exercise because I don't have any natural exercise in my lifestyle. I don't walk to the grocery. I drive to Costco and buy a month and a half worth of food. And so I think that the healthy lifestyle is more apparent in Japan. Also, the diet is healthier, less dairy, less red meat consumption, healthier way of preparing food. And I think those things impact what's going on here in Singapore as well. And surprisingly, there are aspects of the diet here that are just not particularly healthy. And one of the things that strikes me is when I go and buy a cold tea in a 7-Eleven, there's like more sugar than tea. I think that there's a lot of sugar and salt in the diet, and it would be really, one of the things we really want to know is what's going on with the 3 different ethnicities here in Singapore. It's hard to get data on life expectancy in those ethnicities, but we can at least try to measure biologic aging. Also, I should point out that socioeconomic status has a big effect on this. So if you look at the wealthiest and the poorest counties in the United States, there's a 10 to 15 year difference in life expectancy. And so there's socioeconomic factors coming into this equation too that are important.
Brian, when I was reading up before your talk, I seem to recall that there is about a 10-year difference between your country of origin and some of the higher longevity countries like Hong Kong, Japan. Is that all basically lifestyle? Is it driven by obesity principally?
Well, the United States we could talk all day about the problems with the healthcare system in the United States. Essentially, we spend 19% of our GDP on healthcare. We have the 50th longest life expectancy and we rank 35th in childbirth mortality. So it's not particularly good all the way around. And I think that there's some if you're wealthy in the US, you get really good healthcare and you live a long time. The problem is we still have tens of millions of people that are underinsured or uninsured. These people are not going to the doctor regularly. Another challenge with that is that people of lower socioeconomic status, it used to be in the old days, they ate pretty healthy because the cheap foods were fruits and vegetables that you got locally. Now that's completely changed. And so that if you're a single mother with 2 kids working 2 jobs and trying to stay afloat, you don't have time to cook. You're going to McDonald's, you're buying potato chips. And so that augments bad diet. So we have an obesity epidemic in the US. We have poor health care. We also have an opioid epidemic in the US that's taking out a lot of young people. And that doesn't say much about aging, but it certainly affects the life averages. And that's not even mentioning things like violence. And so I think that the U.S. is becoming an example for what not to do at the moment, and it's unfortunate. But that also is part of the reason I'm here. I think Singapore, there's a real opportunity to show if we really focus on prevention and health, the impact could be really dramatic, and this is a good test ground to try to demonstrate that. So that's one of the reasons I'm excited to be here.
Brian, we've got a great question from Karen West, who's our Dean of Research and a Professor of Nursing in Cairns, who asks about personalized medicine and asks if we will get to a broadly individualized model of healthcare based on genetics.
Yeah, I think that, well, first of all, genetics is probably not the only answer, but it's certainly one of the answers. If you look at life expectancy, genetics predicts about 25 to 30% of your longevity. Lifestyle, where you live, and all these other factors are comprising the rest. Now, there are exceptions to that. If you look at centenarians like my grandmother, they chose the right parents. So basically, rarely what happens is you get the right combination of genes, and then genetics plays a huge role. And those people didn't live particularly healthy lives or anything else, but they still get to 100. The majority of the population, though, it's largely about lifestyle. So genetics is one factor, but I think we have to combine that with lifestyle and a whole range of other measures. But yes, I think what we want to do is really optimize to the individual. And I'll give you a quick example of that, because we're really interested in vitamins right now. But if you look at things like vitamin D, vitamin E, the meta-analysis shows they don't do anything. But I don't think we're doing those studies right. People ask me all the time when I give talks, should I take vitamin D? And I ask back, well, I don't know. What are your levels of vitamin D? Nobody ever knows the answer to that question. So what we're trying to do is go back, first in animals, and try to take each animal and optimize the level of these vitamins and micronutrients. So this get the animal into the optimal range. And I'm predicting that's going to have a huge effect on lifespan, 20, 30, maybe more percent. And if we can demonstrate that and figure out how to do it, then we can do that in the human studies as well. And so that's a personalization based on clinical measures. But I think that the potential is enormous for what can be done there.
Brian, we got a great question from Susan about diet and I suppose for a bit of a summary around those useful compounds like nitric oxide, AKG, etc., and the extent to they can be acquired in table foods rather than synthetic supplements.
I could talk for a long time on healthy diets and aging, and I think that's another case where things are highly personalized. But generally speaking, vegetarian-rich diet, low red meat, low dairy, low processed sugar. We tend to think carbohydrates are bad for you. That's not the case. But processed sugars are at high levels are not what we evolved to deal with, and that's probably not good for us. Let me diverge. I'll come back to the molecules in a sec. Let me diverge just 1 second. Right now everybody's into keto diets and things like that. But if you look in animals, every animal that's been tested, mice, worms, even wasps, I don't know why people tested wasps, but they did. If you take an isocaloric diet, so you maintain the total calorie content, and then you vary the macronutrients, what you find is high carb, low protein is the way to live a long time, not high protein, low carb. But those are complex carbs. And also, we're keeping the overall calorie intake normal there. I think the biggest problem people have with calories is it's a great way to get way too many calories. The average American male is eating 3,900 calories a day when they should be eating 2,200. Carbs are a great way to get there. So I think if you're eating the right level of calories, the best thing to do is to really balance the micronutrients and not focus on only fats and protein or some of these diets that are out there. The natural products, it really depends on which one we're talking about. Alpha-ketoglutarate is not available in diets, not available in food sources, so it has to be delivered exogenously. Spermidine is in a whole lot of different foods, green leafy vegetables, other things, and so nitric oxide has to be made. So it really depends on what we're talking about. But yeah, there are food sources that are rich in phytochemicals and things that may be protective for aging, and those are typically the vegetables. So colored vegetables are good too. So I think that trying to get a vegetable-enriched diet is a good way to go.
I got a question, Brian, from Anita, which is around a personal pharmacological issue, and so I'm not going to take that one, and just to remind people that we're not giving clinical advice in the session. But I got another one around the use of AKG, and is it being considered for treatment of COPD?
Yeah, so it's a very good idea. We haven't tried to start to treat that, try to do disease models to see if that's effective or not, but we're intrigued by that. We're really trying to understand what's happening at the vascular level, what's happening in lung regeneration, what's happening in oxygen delivery with AKG. It's just we can't get to all of these conditions. I will say that COPD is, and from the aging biology perspective, it's vastly understudied. It's like the third or fourth cause of mortality, and a lot of aging researchers focus on neurodegeneration and heart disease and diabetes, but we need to do a lot more studies on COPD, I believe, and also pulmonary fibrosis, because these are major issues in the elderly population, and we tend to understudy them. So yeah, it's a good idea. We don't have any data.
Brian, there's an anonymous question which is around about the point at which you introduce an intervention to try and extend the health span, and whether any of your studies have addressed the sort of the diminishing returns, I suppose, of going back and introducing dietary supplements for younger subjects, and whether that features in your portfolio?
I mean, I think we'd like to get there and see what happens, but we're really not approaching that yet. Certainly, we encourage healthy diet, exercise, adopting good lifestyle patterns as young as possible, preferably in childhood. So that from the lifestyle intervention, yeah, we're very active about encouraging people to do that. But from the supplement and drug side, we want to start with a limited population that are high risk because we think it's easier to justify that with ethics boards and things like that. So, but you're right. We need to look across the whole life course. And I would say that, that's one thing that we tend to think of this Hippocratic oath of don't do harm as, we interpret that as don't do harm. And then we interpret that as don't treat healthy people. But I think we need to revisit that concept, because what is a healthy person, by the way? And what is an unhealthy person? And I think that if we took a more life course approach to healthcare, where we're working with people throughout their lives to try to optimize their health, we'll see tremendous amount of benefit from that. And one of the things we're trying to do is say, this is really a medical revolution. We think that we need to be working with people all the time and trying to figure out how to keep them healthy. And if we do that, we'll save a whole lot of money, because it'll dramatically delay the onset of their diseases. And that's a challenging, it doesn't sound that complicated, but trying to put something like that in place in a healthcare industry that's heavily driven by the profit you make off treating sick people is an interesting endeavor. I've been making that argument for 15 years, and I'm not sure how much traction we're getting yet. So.
I think we've got time for one last question, and I'm going to go right to the first one, which was around the possibility of overpopulation. And I suppose that one of the issues that you raised in your very first slide, I think, Brian, which was the ratio of working age people to the number of, healthy retirees, and how, to the extent to which you're working with public policy people around that issue, and the sort of sustainability of aging populations more generally.
Yeah, I think that this is a challenging issue for everyone right now, because to me, I don't see the difference between trying to treat aging and trying to treat cancer. A third of the population gets cancer, everybody gets aging, so we don't do anything about aging and spend billions and billions of dollars trying to treat cancer. Conceptually, that doesn't make sense to me. I think if you're having functional decline as you get older, we should be trying to do something about it. But it really is a change in mindset for a lot of people, and it's hard for people to grasp that concept. There are a whole lot of reasons for that. And I will say that there are questions arise all the time about, well, if you make people live much longer, what's that going to do to population and all those things. But that's kind of a false claim, because first of all, if you look at the longest lived countries in the world, they're not worried about too many babies, they're worried about not enough babies. You can predict when the last Japanese person is going to be on Earth right now, based on their low rate of reproduction. And that low rate of reproduction is here in Singapore too. It's 1.1 or 1.2 in the Chinese ethnicity. And so, population increases geometrically by babies. It doesn't, a linear increase in health span is not likely to have a big impact on that. In fact, we just started to center on reproductive longevity. And so it's really reproductive longevity and equality. The idea is that, are these things affecting aging also driving ovarian decline and loss of fertility? And can we preserve fertility longer so that women have more choices? I mean, one of the reasons they don't want to have babies is they want to pursue their career, and they don't want to take the time out in their 20s to do that, which is totally understandable. And if we can find ways to allow women to have healthy babies in their 30s or early 40s, that gives them a lot more freedom to choose their own life course. And so, I think all of these things are going to have profound effects on demographics. And just one last point, if we slow aging or even stop aging, things aren't going to change that fast, right? Because, you're still only moving 1 year at a time. So the demography is going to change. If we get to the point where we reverse aging, and David Beckham is back playing soccer for Man U, that's going to be a profound change in society. And I think that's going to lead to a lot of unexpected things. And I don't think we're close to that yet. But I will say that I don't think that's impossible. I think we don't know, but it's starting to look that like things like that may ultimately be more possible than we ever imagined.
Brian, I'm going to draw things to a close there. I'm going to, say a huge thank you from JCU for sharing
My pleasure.
your time, your knowledge so generously, and it has led to a fascinating discussion that I'm sure that we will continue to think about on our journeys home. I wish you well in your endeavors, and I hope that you get a whole bunch of healthy volunteers to participate in your studies over at NUS. A lot of people have asked about the video sharing, and I'll ask Erica to pick that up immediately after we close.
Yes.
The one final thing I would ask you all to do is to complete the poll before you exit, and I'm sure that, in fact, just popped up on my screen now. So thanks for participating. Please keep an eye on our website for future outings in our Healthy Aging series, and wish you all good health and long life.
Thanks a lot.